middle class phenomenon is very important. I mentioned earlier that when our population was about 600 or 800 million, we had a tiny sliver of a middle class, and they were marginalized politically and often chose to emigrate. This phenomenon used to be called the brain drain. They used to leave the country, and we used to, tear our hair out that the country spent a lot of people educating people like Parth and me, and then we leave. That has changed. What has changed is that the size of the middle class has grown dramatically. Now, you can argue about what the exact size is, depending on how you define the middle class. Some people define it as little as 150 million, other people define it as 300 or a bit more than that. Even if you assume that the number is somewhere in between, 250 million, say. It's a significantly larger chunk today than ever before. And even though politically they're still a minority, out of the 543 seats in the lower house of parliament, only 120 are urban, where the middle class have a significant impact. So poorer people, people who are not yet middle class, still have by far a much larger influence in voting. But the middle class have other sources of authority and power. The disposable income of the Indian middle class has grown dramatically over the past 20 years. A large part of the consumer goods that are bought and the services that are bought and the infrastructure that is used by the middle class. And as a result, the media tends to pay disproportionate attention to the middle class's concerns. So you'll see increasingly, if you read the editorials, if you look at the news stories, they are focused very heavily on the concerns of the middle class. And this is a good thing, because A, it gives the middle class disproportionate clout in the setting of the national agenda, in the setting of the debate, which they didn't have earlier because of sheer numbers. Now this actually, and this is something I've written about extensively, is a déjà vu of what happened in America about 100 years ago. Now if you look at the American political situation, starting from after the Civil War in the second half of the 19th century, you had a period when the economy grew dramatically and the politics was very messy with enormous corruption, with robber barons, and you see a lot of that in India today. The economy growing dramatically, politics in flux, and both in America in the late 19th century and India, dramatic transformation away from being a rural agricultural country to more of an urban middle class country. Now it's going to take us some decades to get there, but that change is happening. And thus, middle class, which was apathetic in the country, coming out on the streets, protesting against crime, protesting against corruption, is a relatively new phenomenon, and it is beginning to help change our politics. What happened in America after that period, which was known as the Gilded Age in the late 19th century, was the so-called progressive era in the early 20th century, which led to a lot of political reforms, a lot of cleaning up of politics. The old backroom Tammany Hall system of fixing politics gave way to a lot more public participation. And that is something that hasn't yet happened in India, but you can see the beginnings of that movement. So in India today, we have political parties that don't have internal democracy. There's a lot of nepotism. There's a lot of backroom fixing. How you get to be the candidate of a political party has less to do with your individual popularity and more to do with which strings you can pull inside the party. And as I said, if you're part of the boys' network or not. And that is bound to change. As we have real democracy, but internal democracy within the parties is still something that is a work in progress.